All right. Evening, everyone. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Program Teacher Certification Training course. Please be seated. Hope everyone's doing well today here in Texas and many places throughout the United States, at least in the southeastern portion. We're experiencing a little bit of chilly weather, not as much as it is up north. But this gives us an opportunity to come in and warm ourselves up and continue to be fed with some education that will help us to improve our society as a whole, including what we see here right now, not right now, this very moment, but what we recognize, at least the science community recognizes global warming and how it is affecting the earth and the temperature swings, the disastrous weather that is taking place to great extremes. Many in the scientific community are acknowledging that these are the results of mankind's activities over a long period of time, not just anything that's occurred over the last year or so, but over a long period of time, our activities build up to affect our environment, our global environment, our ecosystem around us. And this is why character education is so important, because we can't discount anything that we interact with on an everyday basis. I mean, we can't, just look at, the trees and the grass, or even bugs, bees and those pesky little mosquitoes, flies. They all have a purpose to enable us to be able, that is us as mankind, to be able to enjoy life. And when things are kept in the proper balance, when morals are practiced on a daily basis, when they're taught, they're accepted, and they're put into practice, then we can have, health and peace in all areas of society, whether at home or at work, if you decide to go out and go camping, whatever the case might be. And it's hard. I can see how it could be easily overlooked, those little things, but all those little things add up to big things. Somebody said, what would occur if even just one species of insects were wiped off of the face of the earth, that they were no longer in existence. You think about ants, you think about something like bees, you think about mosquitoes, and there are many different types of insects that are considered pollinators. Well, we probably wouldn't have very much food, right? Because those things are necessary for pollinating plants in order for them to grow. Trees and bushes and fruits and vegetables and pretty much everything that must grow needs that pollination in order to take place. That process of pollination and many other things that take place as well. And we're seeing that unfold right now as it seems like the world is just kind of crumbling around us. Well, with what we're learning here in the building of a positive moral character, a sound moral character, what we're talking about in this particular class in chapter 1 of the unit on self-control, and all the foundation that has been laid in the previous units before today, these lessons are helping us to be responsible as individuals in society, whether one or many, to contributing to turning what we see taking place with the degradation of our environment and our ecosystem, turning all that around and eventually begin a rebuilding process. It's going to take some time, but it will take place, because if it is us as mankind that have brought these things down, then it's us as mankind that can fix it, right? The breaking of the rules has brought about a lot of sickness, and the keeping of the rules will bring about much health. And so keep these things in mind, because everything that we're learning, it contributes to a bigger picture, right? This is more than just about us as individuals. This is more than just about us knowing this and teaching it to ourselves. Yes, we teach it to ourselves when we study it, and we teach it to ourselves when we teach others as well. But this is about creating a positive ripple effect throughout society, in which we can actually see all of these negative things that we suffer on a regular basis, whether it's in paying, $5 for a loaf of bread when it used to be only 50 cents for a loaf of bread. The cost of paying for theft, or the increase in just many items that we see in today's society. It's hard for the average family just to afford, food for a family of five because of the cost of living. But we can see that actually turn around, and there be abundance and plenty for others if these moral principles are taught, accepted, and practiced. So keep that in mind as we move forward today. And I want you to think about this because we're still talking about thoughts, okay, and the choices that we make, and the choices that we have to make on a daily basis, a regular basis, every second of the day for the most part. Decisions are being made. Like was brought out in the previous class. I want you to think about this number here: 958,125,000. Okay, now that's based on for just class purposes here, the average lifespan of about 75 years. All right, of a person living about 75 years. Now, some people live longer, some people might live a little bit less, depending on their circumstances. But at approximately 35,000 thoughts per day by 365 days by 75 years, that's the approximate amount of thoughts or decisions, I should say, that you will make on average, right? And remember, not all those are necessarily conscious thoughts. And when I was listening to the class again, going over that and listening to what William was saying about that article about the decision making, we think about things, we make decisions on things that we don't even really hardly give much attention to, right? And I stopped. Well, I didn't stop, but while I was driving down the road listening to that class, I tried to count the amount of things that I was doing that I consciously made a decision to do. Right? I looked to the right. I looked in my passenger mirror, and then I looked back forward. Then I flipped on my turn signal, and I went. You don't think about that, but those are all decisions that we make. Okay. Now, if I chose not to do some of those things while I was driving, I could possibly bring harm to myself or somebody else, or cause damage to my vehicle or somebody else's property. So we see how important decision making is. Now, the only reason that I or anybody else who has a driver's license or who doesn't have a driver's license, but maybe working on a farm or a ranch or something like that, is able to drive is because they understand the rules to operating that vehicle and operating that vehicle safely. And once we get into a habit of knowing what to do and how to do it, it becomes kind of a second nature to us, where we don't have to stop and look at the turn signal and flip it up and then look back at the road and then look to the road. You just automatically do it. And this is what we're learning to do, not only in regards to decisions for activities such as driving, but decisions for activities such as choosing between right and wrong, moral or immoral, positive and negative, because it's our character, the choices that are based on our character, what type of character that we have, which is going to enable us to be a benefit to society, a joy to be around, someone who can add to another person's learning, or harmful to society. Somebody you don't want to be around, someone that's going to be detrimental to someone's learning or building of a positive character. So we're going to be picking up, or continuing, I guess I should say, on page 20. Let's go back here to the lesson plan. And let's look at lesson plan 1, page F. And we're going to look at procedure number 7 here. And it says, tell students you are going to give them a tool to help them remember to practice self-control. Write the letters of the word stop vertically on the board and instruct students to read the section entitled Putting It All Together, found on page 21. Have students complete the activity found on pages 22 to 23. And tell students this will allow them to practice recognizing negative thoughts and practice self-control in order to avoid negative feelings and actions. All right, so recognizing negative thoughts. In other words, being able to distinguish or to determine whether a thought that enters into your mind is negative, okay? And not just look over it with a glance and allow it to be an influence to you, because thoughts are influencers to each and every one of us. And so if, the student does not recognize that a thought that has entered into their mind is, in this case, a negative influence, then they might allow themselves to be subject to that influence and, make decisions based on that, right? Instead of redirecting their thoughts towards something that's positive. So let's look at page 21, and I want to pay attention to certain of the points that are going to be brought out here in the words. But at the very top here on page, I'm sorry, not page 21, but page 20. Page 20, it says here at the very top, to do or not to do. That is the question. Well, the answer, or self-control, is the answer. To do or not to do. That is the question. And if you remember what we covered in the previous classes here, we talked about positive options brings rewards, and we talked about the difference between what a positive option is and the results or the rewards that come as when a person chooses an option. And on the previous page, on page 17, what a negative option is and what what consequences come when we select a negative option. Okay, and remember on the top of page 17 here, in regards to these choices, it says a choice or option, choices or options can basically be placed into two categories, negative or positive. Here are a few points to help you distinguish between a positive and a negative choice. Okay, and like William covered in the class on page 16 under It's a Matter of Choice, in referring to another important step in developing self-control is understanding the role of choices in the way you think, feel, and act. The choice is the power to make a selection between one or more options. Okay, so let's go back to page 20 here, and we're going to see why self-control is the answer. Now, let's look at that first paragraph there, and let's read through it, and then we'll start kind of breaking it down a little bit. It says, another important aspect of proper decision making is learning to weigh your options. Weighing your options means taking the time to consider the possible outcomes of each choice before acting, and then making a decision that is morally correct. So this process here, right, of thinking before acting, or considering the possible outcomes of each choice before acting will eliminate the much suffered uh-oh response, right? That it eliminate that uh-oh factor out of a person's life, because when we act impulsively, then we have the uh-oh. What was that old commercial? Uh-oh, better get Mako, right? Because you banged your car up or whatever, because you decided to drive around somebody because they were going too slow, only to find out that they were waiting for traffic that you couldn't see, okay? But if you would have thought carefully that that person might be waiting there for a reason, you wouldn't have just drove around that person and got into that accident. Well, this is what weighing our options out, okay, means. It also says here, before acting and then making a decision here. Now remember here, it's when we think about our choices, when we think about our decision-making process, and what we're learning in the Peaceful Solution, negative should never be an option in our mind, right? We acknowledge and we know that it's there. Why? Because that's what society brings forth. There are so many different negative influences. We talked about the effects of character within the family in chapter 2 of the character unit. That could be something that is bred into an individual, something that could be a part of their environment, the examples that they've seen. So there are a lot of factors that could bring about a negative option, and it's necessary, like we just read there, for the students to recognize that a particular option is negative, but the focus is not on that negative option. Remember what we learned also, to accentuate the positive, to build up, to emphasize, to really focus on. Let that be the direction for your course of action. That's our goal, our positive, but eliminate the negative. The negative will take care of itself. It'll wipe itself out if you don't give it the energy, right? When we give attention to, our focus our thoughts on any particular thing, whether it's positive or negative, we kind of give energy to that particular thing, right? Because our minds, remember we talked about our conscious and our subconscious minds. Our subconscious mind will take notice of your conscious mind focusing on a particular topic, subject, thought, influence, whatever the case might be. And then the subconscious mind, by default, feels that that's what you're training it to focus on. So now when something arises, it's going to go back to its system of training, right? And say, well, we use this negative thing, or it's not going to really distinguish between positive or negative, is that we use this process of thinking. So this must have to be how we respond. And then you're cursing somebody out, right? Because that's how you've seen it done, or that person looked pretty cool when he came back with that comeback, or whatever the case might be, or that guy, he's a black belt in martial arts, and that guy was talking smack to him and he just, hit him with a drop kick, If those are the things that we see and we value, that's what we're going to revert back to. That's a part of the negative options that we want to eliminate and focus on the positive. And so when we're making a decision, we want to make sure, and this is kind of key here, and I underline really this whole paragraph here, but we want to make sure that it is morally correct. Now remember, the morals, they refer to and are part of the supporting and practicing of the rules. It's correct, morally correct, beneficial, and even in this beneficial and advantageous aspect, it's not just only beneficial to the person who's practicing morality or using morality in their decision-making process. When a person decides not to steal from another person, they're not only benefiting themselves from not stealing from that person, but the person to whom they were going to steal from whom they were going to steal, even though they might not realize it, they've received a benefit from it as well. Because now they don't have to worry about coming out, to work in the morning and their car's gone, or their bike's gone, or whatever's gone, or their lawnmower's gone or missing, or someone's broken into their house because they were on vacation or they were at work, or whatever the case might be. You see, they receive a benefit, although unbeknownst to them, when a person chooses to morally when the person chooses to make decisions that are morally correct, beneficial, and advantageous. And this goes right back to that positive ripple effect that we spoke about in the character unit there. Even if we don't take into consideration how far-reaching our decisions might be. And most young people won't. Most young people kind of, about the length of their arm from their body, that's sometimes how far out they think, okay? Not to say that they don't think long-term with a lot of things, but, with a lot of young people, and each and every one of us have been young ourselves, the only time we thought far out is when, for the most part, something didn't go our way, and we couldn't wait till we were 18, or we couldn't wait till we were 21, and we could do whatever we want to do, right? That's kind of how far out our thinking went. But it's up to us as the teacher to help the students realize that their decisions stretch far beyond the choices that they make today, right? And then that next sentence there, that last sentence says, a proper decision is made only after you have weighed your options. Only after you have weighed your options. And so now I want to go back to the very top of that paragraph there, because what we're looking at, what we see here, it's worded, it says another important aspect. So which means that this goes right along with the previous aspects that were covered in the few pages that were before this. And I wrote down one of the aspects is deciding what to focus on and what to let go in regards to decision-making process. Because remember, our decisions don't just come, generally speaking, from a spur-of-the-moment type thing. There is some thought that goes into that decision-making process, some influence that goes into the choices that we make and the options that we consider, and whether we consider those options are positive or negative, beneficial or harmful. Well, the first point I have there is deciding what to focus on and what to let go, and we covered that on page 16 back here. under its excuse me, under it's a matter of choice. And in the first paragraph, let's see here. Well, kind of down toward the middle of that first paragraph, it says, "You choose which thoughts to focus on and which to let go." All right, because it says just before that, it says, "A choice is the power to make a decision or selection between one or more options, and every day you make choices." Like was covered in the previous class, approximately 35,000 decisions are made a day. Now that's approximate number because no one knows the thoughts that goes through every person's mind and the decisions that are made by every individual, but that's, probably a pretty decent estimation. Unless you're in a field of work where there are a lot of activities going on. If you're in some type of analytical firm or something like that, and you're looking at numbers, like say on the some like a stockbroker or something, and they're constantly, watching the boards and seeing the trends and the stocks go up and down, and they're making calls and they're calling out things. They're doing quite a bit of things. They might make many more decisions than 35,000 in addition to the regular decisions that they make on a daily basis. But you can see, every day you're making choices, and it is up to us now. You see, you choose. This is us, we as the individual who are reading this, choose which thoughts to focus on and which to let go. Now, in regards to events and circumstances in our life, I know that, probably safe to say many of us have probably been through at least one traumatic thing, that we've experienced in our life. And, whether it's a car accident or, suffering the loss or injury in your own life or witnessing someone else suffer that type of thing, the natural tendency is to kind of rehearse that over and over and over and over again, right? I remember once when I was in a car accident, and it was nothing major, but I remember being in the car accident, and it was kind of a shock and the trauma, when that actually took place. And it took several days throughout the day of me catching those thoughts and that scenario and the events that led right up to, during, and after that accident before I kind of chose to let it go. Because your mind kind of, especially when there's some type of emotional trauma that goes along with it. The emotions are very powerful, and we're going to get into this in the next chapter, because those emotions, they can strengthen a thought, to the point where a person is more likely to act on it, right? You've heard of the expression crime of passion, right? A crime of passion. A person comes and they see something taking place, maybe with or to a loved one or something like that, and they act, they act in the passion, so to speak. Passion does not necessarily mean between a man or a woman, but it could just be, you could be very passionate about many things, right? And they suddenly act impulsively without considering the consequences of their actions. And sometimes somebody gets injured, something gets destroyed, or someone loses their life as a result. And there's even laws on the law books that refer to, crimes of passion. And some people have, been let go, so to speak, not been prosecuted because of certain scenarios or circumstances. We're not going to get into that this evening. But the main point here I wanted us to focus on is you choose which thoughts to focus on and which to let go. And they give you example of getting up and getting breakfast. You decide basically what you're going to eat for breakfast, and even if you want to eat anything for breakfast, all right? And so that's one of the points, or that's one of the aspects in proper decision making, choosing what to focus on and what to let go. Again, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative. Now, these are things that have to kind of go back. We have to go back and reiterate in bringing our students to this point, because, they might be undecided about what to focus on and what to let go. They might let go of a lesser of two evils because the other one does not seem as bad, or they might not get in as much trouble, right? It's up to us as a teacher to say, no, if there are two decisions that two options that you're thinking about, and both can bring harm to yourself or someone else, you have to eliminate both of them, and bring about or focus on or maybe get guidance or direction. If they can't think of it themselves, then if that's the point where they need to get guidance or direction, even before that, from a trusted adult, a counselor, a parent, a teacher, someone who can redirect those negative thoughts towards something that's positive. Okay. And so the next point there, another aspect of proper decision making is distinguishing between positive and negative options. And we covered that on page 17 under choices, in that paragraph at the very top there. Choices or options can basically be placed into two categories, negative or positive. Here are a few points, and this is given here on the next two pages, to help you distinguish between a positive and a negative choice. So now we see here, after we've understood that we can focus or let go of certain things, now we have to be able to distinguish between what's positive and what's negative so we can know what to focus on and what to let go of. And then lastly here, this next aspect of proper decision making is weighing your options. Weighing your options. All right. And think about what we just read here. Weighing your options means taking the time to consider the possible outcomes. Taking the time to consider the possible outcomes. Now, this takes in mind, if you go back in your character unit there. Yes. When you go back in your character unit, when you take the time to weigh, to consider the possible outcomes before acting and then making a decision that is morally correct, beneficial, and advantageous. Now, when we think about this as adults, we see it from a kind of broader point of view or spectrum, because in order to do this, there are certain other character traits that we've already covered. Now, self-control is kind of the main thing of what we're talking about and what needs to be practiced in order to be able to weigh our options and to make choices that are morally correct. But we can't discount the other things that have to come into play in order for us to even stop and think and weigh our options out, right? Think about if a person is proud or arrogant, right? And they think that they have all the answers and that anything they say or do is automatically going to be right. Will they weigh their options out? Will they weigh their choices out? Heavens no, they're not going to weigh their choices out, because they're proud or arrogant, So this is evident that, one of the characteristics, and this is something that we covered in the first chapter of the character unit, is humble. Having a humble character, a humble attitude about that. In this case of what we're talking about and weighing our choices, and remember that was the definition for that was not being proud or arrogant. Example being a humble person will not argue, dispute, or disobey set rules. Okay. As we move further along into this, we're going to, see that humility also is a part of humility is also willing to be trained, right? Willing to be trained, willing to be taught, willing to be educated, right? In the facts, the true facts that will enable you to make a sound moral decision. Right? If you're not willing to learn anything, if you think you already know it all, you're not going to be willing to learn anything, and you're going to keep making those same poor choices that you've been making for however many years. Like the person says, I've been doing this for all these years. Well, is it possible that you've been doing it wrong for all these years? It sure is. Now it's time to learn how to do it right, how to do it properly. And that does require humility, right? It does require humility from all of us. When you think about it, it also requires being a responsible person. You think about on page 17 in the character unit, one of the first things this says is being responsible is another trait you should want to make a part of your character. Being responsible means to be accountable and answerable for your actions. Now, that is the latter part. Your actions are the latter part of what we're talking about today. That's the end result, or what everybody else sees about what we're talking about right here, which is our decision-making process, okay? Because every action, every word begins with a thought. And whether a person thinks that it does or not, it does, okay? And it's part of our responsibility as the teachers to help our students to understand that yes, everything you say and do begins with the thought. But we want you to be able to consider your thoughts, to weigh out your thoughts, to weigh out your options, right? To carefully diagnose these things that enter into your mind. Remember, thoughts enter into our mind at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. You know, they enter into our minds, and we can probably respond almost as fast, right? You think about, I use this expression, about driving, down the road, and think about how fast or how quickly, as you're driving down the road, you come to a stoplight and you see that light turn from yellow to red, how quickly it takes for you to process that image of that stoplight, recognizing it as being red. Now, being red, who cares? It's a red light. Well, that's pretty. No? You'd have to be trained and educated to recognize the difference between what a red light means, what a yellow light means, and what a green light means, right? You have to know that the green arrow or the flashing yellow arrow light that's in the turning lane does not mean to look left every time it flashes. You would have to know that. You'd have to be first educated, through driver's education or whatever the case might be. You'd have to know the rules of the road to know that red means stop, right? And yellow does not mean what? That's right. It doesn't mean go faster. That's what a lot of people do, right? Yellow means be careful because the light is getting ready to turn red, okay? And I think many of us have had green lights occur on our lane and seen a car drive through the intersection because they didn't, take into consideration that they were supposed to be stopping. But think about how quickly you see that light turn red. You process that information in your mind that is red. You don't have to think at that moment. Let's see, green, yellow, red. Let's see, red, turn, stop. Yeah, stop, okay. I will take my foot off of the right pedal, bring my leg up, slide it over to the big pedal on the left, or middle if you have a clutch, and then press it down firmly until the brakes engage and I come to a complete stop. We don't have to go through that process. Our brains instantly do it, 186,000 miles per second. Those thoughts and those neurons and those, transmitters are doing their jobs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All we do is process the thought and we make the decision to stop at that red light or go if you're not a rule keeper, all right? So this means that we are accountable. This is a responsible person. This is also what they call a responsible driver. And insurance companies are using things and incentives to, get people to be more responsible in their driving. Some of these companies have, I think they call it telematics, where you could actually plug a device into your OSB. It's not called OSB, but it's a little computer port on your vehicle. It might be USB or OBS or something like that. No, not USB. But you can plug that into your car. It's basically where you can check diagnostics of your vehicle or something like that if the check engine light is on. And it will send a signal back to the insurance company. And what it'll tell them if you're a speeder, if you're a person who uses your turn signals, if you make jerky accelerations, or if you stop hard, if you swerve in and out of traffic, because all that data is stored on your computer in your car. And it sends that data to the insurance company, and then they can tell, wow, this person is accountable for following the rules of the road. They're less of a risk to other drivers on the road. Therefore, we will reward them by giving them a lower insurance rate. Or, this person probably should not be driving because our reports show that they spend more time on the sidewalk than they do on the road. Therefore, we're going to raise their rates. Why? Because they're more of a risk to themselves and other drivers. They're more of a liability to us as an insurance company, and more than likely, we're going to have to pay out some claims pretty soon because this person does not pay attention. So in order for us to be answerable and accountable for our actions, we first must have to be responsible for the thoughts that go into our mind. We must be responsible for the things we choose to focus on and let go. We must be responsible for deciding on if we act on a negative thought or let go of one, or if we act on a positive thought or let go of that. And of course, educated is also getting the facts and making sure they are correct before making a decision. All these things, they kind of go into this process of what we're talking about in this first paragraph here, of weighing out your options. All these other character traits that also play a part in it. So we can't set those aside and say we're only focusing on self-control. But oddly enough, you need to have self-control in order to practice these other character traits, right? So they kind of go hand in hand, or in this type of weather, hand in glove, hopefully a heated glove, in order for them to work. And we have to consistently practice this before it becomes a habit, before it becomes a way of life for us, and then it becomes automatic. So here, lastly, it says, a proper decision is made only after you have weighed your options. And I wanted to read a definition here about this word proper here, because at the very beginning it says the important aspect of a proper decision making is learning to weigh your options. And when you think about the word proper, a lot of times you might think about the old fancy, sitting in your seat with your back straight and your legs together and your hands crossed, and ready to eat your meal or whatever the case might be. And that kind of ties somewhat into this definition when we talk about societal norms or standards. But the definition for this word proper is according to or respecting recognized social standards. Now, I want to cautious us in our thinking in regards to recognized social standards, because social standards change from culture to culture, society to society, time, generation to generation, nations to nation, right? What we have to take into consideration is, and what we're talking about are social standards that tie into the upholding of the rules, right? The keeping of the rules, okay? Not just any old standard. It might be a standard to see a bike sitting on the side of the road in that particular culture or society, and I don't feel like walking anymore. I'm just going to hop on the bike, and then I'll leave it somewhere else. Now, if it's a ride share bike or a program like that where you have permission to, that's a totally different thing. But you can't just take someone else's belongings and decide you're going to ride it because you're tired anymore. And that's kind of a out there example, but that could be an example of a social standard. It also says, according to or respecting recognized social standards or conventions. Now, in regards to these social standards, I kind of want you to think about, the simplicity of this. When we have, just take this intermediate book here, series, I guess I should say, in the Peaceful Solution. And the elementary is pretty much the same. We have 5 there, and they build up to this. And then we have the 5 books that we have here, character, acceptance, self-control, respect, and responsibility. And then the building moral excellence after that. And all of these are these principles given in an age appropriate, the same principles given in an age appropriate way, so that the reader can understand them and apply them to their life and their decision making process. And we think about that and say, this information here, what we're reading, what we're going over, what we're covering in the Peaceful Solution is one of the greatest tools that we can use, the greatest standards that we can use in interacting with society, our environment, our neighbor, our family, our friends, coworkers, whatever the case might be. It's the perfect tool, standard that we can use in order to essentially have peace with one another, okay, including ourselves. We should have peace within our own minds. Now, on the flip side of that, you take into consideration this societal or social standards. There are approximately, now this is an approximate number, when it comes to rules, because what we're covering here are rules, and these moral rules, these principles that we've talked about here and are talking about in the Peaceful Solution, they govern actions. They govern our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. Well, same here with the rules that are in society, and this is just the United States of America. Every country has their set of rules that govern what's right and what's wrong, what's acceptable and what's not, what's lawful and what's unlawful. But in the United States here, and this is just in regards to a field or discipline, I guess I should say, one area of laws. Okay. Um, and it says there are 30,000 plus laws and statutes that have been passed by U.S. legislation. 30,000. Now, back in 1982, the Department of Justice wanted to get an idea of how many laws that there were on the books. Why did they want to get an idea of that? Because they don't even know how many laws there are on the books. that's how many we have in society. And this article here says, in an example of a failed attempt to tally up the number of laws on a specific subject area, just one particular specific subject area, in 1982, the Justice Department tried to determine the number of criminal laws in a project that lasted 2 years. 2 years. Now, granted, I know we've been in these books for quite a long time, but we haven't gotten anywhere near to 30,000 laws, 30,000 principles or anything like that. These are the simple things that govern our interactions between one another, and the outcomes of them, they always bring peace. And one thing we're going to find out about this as we move forward is that they don't change. There's no need to change them. There's no need to readjust what we're finding in these books, the moral principles that are found in these books, in order to fix a problem that arises from something else. Because they don't cause problems. These moral principles solve problems. They prevent problems. But it says here, in a project that lasted 2 years, the department compiled a list of approximately 3,000 criminal offenses. As they say, in today's society, everybody's a criminal. You can do something that I'm sure that you're breaking a rule somewhere. This effort, headed by Ronald Gaynor, who was a Justice Department official, is considered the most exhaustive attempt to count the number of federal criminal laws. And in a Wall Street Journal article about this project, this effort came as part of a long and ultimately failed campaign to persuade Congress to revise the criminal code, which by the 1980s was scattered among 50 titles and 23,000 pages of federal law. As Mr. Gaynor characterized this fruitless project, he said, "You will have died and been resurrected 3 times and still not have an answer to this question." Now, this is one of the Department of Defense people here, officials, saying that it was basically a mission impossible to figure out since the 1700s, 1780, I think, somewhere around in there, how many laws that there are on the books that could make a person a criminal, right? Now, these laws govern the social norms, right? And customs and standards of a particular society. Well, think about this, because when we talk about the peaceful solution, it's simply positive and negative, simply right and wrong. It is in deciding or making a decision, the one thing that we have to consider, does it bring harm to ourselves, others, or the environment, right? We don't have to think, well, according to Section 3 of the Penal Code of, such and such and such, in Paragraph 3 and in Title A, it says, does this bring harm to me, to me, someone else, or the environment, right? And then we can make a decision based on that. Well, here it says here, is learning to weigh your options. Now, in regards to weighing, and this is really interesting, you can do a lot of, it would be great if you, as a teacher, were able to come across the scale, and I don't mean like the new digital scales. I mean like the actual old scales, like what they say. You see that example, I believe, on Lady Justice there, and with the blindfold and pair of scales in one hand, and there's the balancing scales there, right? And there's many different forms of scales, types of scales out there, but they're used to determine the weight of something. And in order to weigh something, to determine its weight, you have to have a standard by which to go by. Otherwise, how are you going to know if something's 1 pound or an ounce or a ton, right? Unless you have that weight of a standard to go by to determine it. In the same way, how do we know if something is right or moral or immoral unless we have a standard to go by. And this is where we're getting from these principles and these values that are found in the peaceful solution here. Well, the definition of this word weigh means to find out how, one of the definition is to find out how heavy something or someone is, typically using scales, or weigh. And the number 2 definition here says assess the nature. Now this is ties more into what we're talking about here. Assess the nature or importance of, especially with a view to a decision or an action or action. So to assess the nature or importance of, especially with a view to a decision or action, because if we don't weigh these things out, then of course we're going to make an impulsive choice, an uneducated choice, a choice in which we have not properly, considered the outcome of what that action will bring now, or down the road, a day, a week, or a month, or a year, or 15 years down the road. Because as we covered in the character unit, there are some decisions that people have made that have affected them for the rest of their lives. Right? Some of these decisions with drugs and drinking or drunk driving, people have to live with those things for the rest of their lives, whether they have been permanently injured or disabled, or whether they permanently injured, disabled, or killed someone else as a result of that decision that they make. There's no going back and unchanging that decision. So in regards to this, tying into this weighing here, or weighing our decisions, internationally, there is a international standard of measurement. Okay, and they use it so that in trade and commerce and everything, when you're trading with different countries or regions, currencies or whatever the case might be, there's one standard that is used. And that way, everything is fair. Everybody knows what they're getting. Everybody knows what they're giving and exchanging for, and you don't have to worry about somebody using one measure of standard and one other measure of standard. Well, it says here the standard, the definition of this word standard is principles or rules of conduct informed by notions of honor and decency. Principles is what I wanted to talk about or focus on there. Principles of conduct or rules of conduct. Remember we covered in the first chapter of the character unit there, those the principles and the values, the moral principles, the moral values, right? These rules that we must follow. It also means the standard unit of measurement is a value that is fixed and cannot be changed. Now we're talking about an international standard of measurement that society uses in order to trade and different things like that. I'm sure you've been to a gas pump and you've seen that sticker on the pump that shows that pump was inspected, and it usually has a sticker that shows that nobody's opened and tampered with the computer there, the measuring device behind there, and it shows that it meets the the standards of the United States Department of I'm not sure if it's trade or commerce or whatever, Federal Trade Commission or something, but it shows that it meets that standard. Okay, if it didn't, then it couldn't be used because somebody's going to be getting cheated, right? Either the person supplying the fuel is going to be getting cheated, or the person purchasing the fuel is going to be getting cheated. It's nothing like squeezing that pump, and it clicking off, and you're seeing already $1.50 there. You only got an ounce of fuel yet. But it says here, it is needed to have uniformity in measurement. Now think about this in regards to our thoughts, right? Uniformity in measurement, measuring or weighing out our thoughts, how we weigh our decisions and actions. Remember, this is a definition of an international standard, but we're tying it into a standard we're learning or gleaning from the peaceful solution that governs how we weigh our thoughts and our actions, right? The decisions that we make. It's a value that is fixed and cannot be changed, right? Stealing is wrong, okay? The standard that governs stealing, or the rules that govern stealing, cannot be changed. You can't change one day the rule that governs stealing in order for it to be right because you really need that thing, right? It's fixed, it's there, it's immovable, right? And in this regard, when we choose, because we have to choose to uphold the rules, to follow these moral principles or these standards, our character can become something that is fixed and unchangeable. And I'm referring to in a positive way. That's what we want, right? We want to be immovable in regards to standing for and upholding positive morals. We want our students to be immovable in that regard too. This is that backbone or that true grit, that integrity that we talked about in the character unit there. It is needed to have uniformity in measurement, and it is the measurement. The measurement is measured in the United States. It's feet and so forth. But in the peaceful solution or character development, it's morals and positive, negative, right and wrong, and so forth. But so we can see the importance here in being able to weigh our decisions. We have to know that there are standards that we have to use. We have to be able to recognize the difference between what's positive and what's negative. We also have to decide on what we choose to focus and let go of. Now, under that next paragraph there, which is after a proper decision is made only after you have weighed your options, it says, in the following scenario, Jason is faced with a problem that will require self-control. Now, notice how he weighs each choice before making a decision. Now, this is Jason here in this scenario, and we're going to look at this here, and it says, Jason was on his way to class. The hallway was packed or crowded as everyone rushed to beat the late bell. Suddenly, someone pushed Jason and he fell on the floor. Jason was very embarrassed, and notice then he felt angry. Now, I'm going to give a spoiler alert here, but we're going to cover that in chapter 3 there. He thought to himself, I can't believe some dumb jerk pushed me down. I bet it was Michael or one of his crew. They're always doing something stupid. Just wait till I catch up with them. Then he thought to himself, yeah, but I can't prove who pushed me down. It could have been an accident for all I know. Besides, trying to retaliate will just make things worse. I'll find out if that person or if that someone did this on purpose. I'll report it, and that way they will be corrected by an authority, and maybe it will help them to see the harm that could have resulted from their actions. All right, now that's a great way of going about it. That seems kind of long, way to process that information, but in effect, when we train ourselves in order to find a peaceful solution in any event or any circumstances, this is kind of in a nutshell the thought process we might go through. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to not go through this embarrassment or even this anger, the secondary emotion of anger which comes up, but at this point we see he had the opportunity to stop and think. Just simply stop and think, right, before he acted. He could have just got up and quick ran down the road or ran down the hallway to catch up and find Michael or whoever it was, and call him out, or lash out, or whatever the case might have been. Retaliate. Now we see here underneath that example, it says, now notice how Jason took the time to think through each of his choices to arrive at a decision that was morally correct. Weighing your options may seem to take a lot of time, but remember, we are the most intelligent species on the planet. We can think at the speed of light. And in the long run, weighing your options before acting will take a lot less time than making a choice that will cost you in many ways, including lost time. I like to compare this to kind of being lazy and, sitting across the room and then throwing that paper in the trash can and it hits the wall and bounces on the floor. Now you got to get up and walk over there anyway. So did you really save any time by throwing that paper across the... I know us guys, we always want to test our skills and so forth to see how well. It makes us feel great to hear that plastic swooshing against that paper, But in many aspects or in many things, we try to find shortcuts to things, and we end up having to spend more time doing it. What they say, if you have time to do it twice, you could have done it right the first time. And this is in regards to a lot of the decisions we make. But remember, some of these decisions that we make, they carry with them lifelong consequences, and there is no going back and doing them over again. So it's important to stress to our students that they really need to stop and think, weigh these decisions out. And it doesn't have to be an instant decision that has to be made right then and there. Not always is that the case. Sometimes they might have to step back and really take a look at everything, everything that is before them. They might have to get an outside a point of view from a parent or a teacher, someone who's going to give them sound moral guidance, not, well, if I were you, type of, bad advice or opinionated advice, someone who's going to guide them in a way that will support their building of a positive moral character, not tear down all the hard work that they've worked so many years to build. I got this from online here. This is actually, I think this might be like for a drug rehab center or whatever, drug alcohol rehab center. But it was interesting because it stuck out to me the very same thing, and other people recognize the importance of thinking before you act. They recognize the importance. Other organizations recognize how beneficial and necessary it is that we stop and think before we act on any thought, whether it's impulsively or just because we just feel like we want to, right? And it says here in this article, it says, thinking before you act keeps you accountable. Now, remember what we talked about in the character trait of responsibility, I believe on page 17 of the character unit there. Thinking of a thought to use puts distance between thought and action. Okay, so you're not, right up against that, carrying something out because you just, whatever the first thought came into your mind, you act on it, but you stop. We're going to see here on page 21, this STOP acronym, we kind of put a little bit of distance between that thought and that action. It's kind of like the closer you follow behind somebody, the less likely you are to avoid a pitfall or a trap or something in the road because you're following so close you can't even see what's in front of them. But when you give yourself distance between you and that person, if there is a pitfall or a stick in the road or a string or something like that, now you have enough time to respond and to act in a way that doesn't bring harm to yourself or others. The more you do this, the easier it becomes to think through, and they're referring to cravings. Whatever that craving might be. It might be a craving to steal. It might be a craving to lash out. It might be a craving to sleep in a little bit longer. If you do not remember anything else, remember to stop when you have a thought. Process the thought, question the thought, and of course they leave out some things, but in what we're teaching you in the Peaceful Solution, weigh that thought out. But weigh it out using the moral standard that we have learned from the Peaceful Solution, and then act. This is why you need the Peaceful Solution, because if you just go off with these things that you see in society, there's going to be pieces missing, and you'll make a bad choice. Thinking before you act isn't just about substance use. This principle also involves the way you treat others and yourself. And so I thought it was interesting because, you can see there are other organizations out there that understand the importance of what we're learning in the Peaceful Solution here. And we want to impress this in the minds of our students before they would end up in the situation where they need to go to a rehabilitation center, right? We want them to understand that if they think about their health and have respect for themselves, they're not going to do things that would cause them to abuse a particular substance and then become addicted to it. And now they need help pulling off of it, okay? Peaceful Solution is about intervention and prevention. But remember, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. So the more we put these things into practice, the better we will be and society around us will be, because we'll be contributing to benefiting society and not being a detriment to it. So we're going to stop right there on page 20, not 2020, but 20. Pick up on page 21 next class, which will be Sunday, the 27th at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. I thank everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next class. Have a great evening, everyone.